"Ma'am, now's time to show them who you really are." The Navy commander's voice cut clean through the salty afternoon air like a bell. For a second, the crowd around us fell silent. 100 proud families had gathered on the parade grounds in Coronado, California that morning, all of them cheering for the newest graduates of the Navy SEAL program. Flags snapped in the wind. The Pacific shimmered just beyond the base. Cameras flashed, mothers cried, fathers stood tall. And there I was, standing off to the side in a simple navy blue dress, hands folded quietly in front of me. Invisible. That was how it had always been in my family. But when the commander stepped forward and saluted me, something shifted. My father's smile vanished. My younger brother blinked in confusion. And suddenly every pair of eyes nearby turned toward the woman my father had just called the dumb one. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back a few minutes earlier. The ceremony had started just after noon. Rows of folding chairs lined the parade field, filled with families who had traveled from all over the country. Texas, Ohio, Nebraska, Florida, everywhere. Some wore cowboy hats. Some wore veteran caps from wars long past. Many clutched programs with trembling hands, waiting for the moment their sons would march across that field. SEAL graduation is different from most ceremonies. It's quieter, more serious. Because everyone there understands what those young men have been through and what they're signing up for. My younger brother Caleb stood among the graduates in his crisp white uniform. Even from where I sat, I could see how straight his posture was. He'd always carried himself that way, like someone who belonged wherever he stood. He was the pride of our family. And my father made sure everyone knew it. We'd flown in from Texas 2 days earlier. Dad insisted on staying at one of those waterfront hotels overlooking San Diego Bay, the kind with polished marble floors and doormen in pressed jackets. He liked appearances. Always had. Before the ceremony even started, he'd already introduced himself to 3 different families sitting nearby. "My boy's the tall one in the 3rd row," he told them, pointing proudly toward Caleb. "Worked harder than anyone I know." No one disagreed. Caleb had always been determined, tough, focused. Everything my father admired. And everything I wasn't. I sat quietly beside them during the ceremony, listening as the instructors spoke about perseverance, sacrifice, and brotherhood. Every so often, Dad would lean toward someone nearby and whisper something about the ranch back in Texas. "The family's been running cattle there for 3 generations," he'd say, 5,000 acres. He liked that number. 5,000 acres. Big enough to impress people. When the final speeches ended and the graduates were officially recognized as Navy SEALs, the applause rolled across the field like thunder. Caleb stepped forward with the others. Dad jumped to his feet before anyone else. "That's my boy," he shouted, clapping so loudly people in the next row turned around. I stood too, of course. I was proud of my brother. Always had been. But Dad's pride came with something else, something sharp. And sure enough, as the applause faded and families began gathering near the graduates, Dad cleared his throat loudly. "Well," he said, puffing out his chest, "time everyone heard the good news." A few relatives and friends from Texas had come to the ceremony as well. They gathered around us in a loose circle, smiling and congratulating Caleb. Dad raised his voice just enough for everyone to hear. "My son here," he said, clapping Caleb on the shoulder, "is going to inherit everything one day." The group murmured approvingly. Dad continued. "The family ranch in Texas, all 5,000 acres of it." More murmurs. "And the penthouse in Manhattan." That one got a few surprised whistles. Dad loved that penthouse. $9 million, 42 floors above Central Park, floor-to-ceiling windows, views that stretched halfway across New York City. He talked about it the way some men talk about trophy buck deer. Caleb shifted awkwardly beside him. "Dad," he said quietly, "you don't have to." But Dad waved him off. "No, son. People should know what kind of legacy you're carrying." Then his eyes drifted toward me. Just a quick glance. But I knew that look. I'd seen it my whole life. He smirked. And as for the other one, he added, jerking his thumb slightly in my direction, "Well?" A few people turned to look at me. Dad chuckled. "The dumb one doesn't get anything." A couple of nervous laughs rippled through the group. Someone shifted uncomfortably. Caleb's smile faded. "Dad," he muttered. But I didn't say a word. I never did. That nickname had followed me since childhood. The dumb one. Dad started using it when I was 12. Not because I failed school. Not because I couldn't do the work. But because I asked questions he didn't like. Why did ranch hands get treated differently than guests? Why did we measure success by land and money? Why did he never listen to Mom? Questions like that. Dad believed smart people didn't ask questions. Smart people followed orders. And I never did. So eventually he decided I must be dumb. I learned early on that arguing with him didn't change anything. So I stopped. Instead, I left home after high school. Packed 2 bags. Drove away from that ranch without looking back. For 22 years, Dad assumed I'd drifted through life doing small jobs and making poor decisions. He never asked. And I never corrected him. It was easier that way. Standing there at Caleb's graduation, hearing the old nickname again after so many years, I felt something stir deep inside me. Not anger. Not even embarrassment. Just a quiet sadness. Caleb looked at me apologetically. "I'm sorry," he said under his breath. I gave him a small smile. "It's all right." And for a moment, everything went back to normal. Families were hugging their graduates. Cameras flashed again. Someone nearby popped open a bottle of champagne. Then I noticed a tall Navy officer walking toward us. His uniform carried the gold trident of the SEAL teams. He moved with the calm confidence of someone used to command. When he reached our group, he didn't look at Caleb first. He looked straight at me. For a heartbeat, my father frowned, confused. The officer stopped 2 steps in front of me. Then he snapped into a sharp salute. "Ma'am," he said respectfully. The chatter around us faded. Dad's eyebrows lifted. Caleb looked back and forth between us. And the officer spoke the words that changed everything. "Ma'am, now's time to show them who you really are." The silence that followed felt like the whole ocean had suddenly stopped moving. The commander's salute hung in the air like a held breath. My father's mouth opened slightly, then shut again. He looked as if someone had pulled the floor out from under his polished shoes. The relatives from Texas, people who'd laughed a moment ago, stared at me with uncertain smiles, waiting for an explanation. Caleb's face was a mix of pride and confusion. He knew I'd been gone a long time, but he didn't know much about where I'd gone. None of them did. Not really. I felt the old instinct rise in me, the urge to shrink, to step back, to let the moment pass without drawing attention. I'd spent most of my life learning how to stay small in my father's shadow. But the commander was still standing there, eyes steady, posture straight. He wasn't asking. He was giving me a choice. And in that instant, I realized something. This wasn't only about me. It was about the years of silence that had made my family think they could define me with a single cruel nickname. I swallowed. "Commander," I said softly, because that's how I speak. I've never been a loud woman. He lowered his hand from the salute and nodded as if we were continuing a conversation that had started long ago. My father finally found his voice. "What is this?" he demanded, trying to turn confusion into authority. "Why are you saluting her?" The commander's gaze didn't flinch. "Sir," he said, measured and respectful, "I'm greeting someone who has served this country with distinction." My father blinked. "Her." He said it like the word itself didn't make sense. The commander didn't answer right away. He glanced toward Caleb, toward the line of graduates still being embraced by their families, then back to me like he was being careful not to steal my brother's day. "Ma'am," he said again, gentler now, "would you like to step aside for a moment?" I nodded and we moved a few feet away from the circle. Not far, just enough that our conversation wasn't at the center of everyone's ears. But of course it was too late. People were watching. Dad didn't follow, but he didn't stop staring either. He stood stiffly beside Caleb, jaw tight. I could almost hear what he was thinking. What have you done now? That thought, what have you done now, had been the soundtrack of my childhood. And if you want to understand why my father could call his own daughter the dumb one in public, you need to understand the kind of house I grew up in. I was raised on a ranch outside San Angelo, Texas. Wide sky, hard ground, and a wind that never seemed to stop. The ranch wasn't just land to my father. It was identity, proof. It was the thing he could point to and say, "I built this. I earned this." My mother used to say the ranch was like another child in the family, one my father loved best. There were 3 of us kids, spaced out just enough to keep my mother exhausted most of the time. Caleb was the youngest. I was the middle. My older sister Rebecca was the firstborn, my father's golden child for most of our early years, before Caleb came along with his easy charm and his hunger to prove himself. Rebecca was the kind of girl who always knew what to say at the dinner table. She learned early how to stroke my father's pride. She'd bring him his coffee without being asked. She'd laugh at his jokes. She'd wear the pretty dresses he liked and stand beside him at church with her head slightly bowed, looking like the picture of a good family. Caleb, even as a boy, was pure motion, running fence lines, tossing hay bales, wrestling calves as if they were toys. My father saw himself in Caleb. That was the beginning of my brother's place in the family, the son my father could mold into a legacy. And me? I wasn't dramatic. I wasn't rebellious in the loud way. I didn't slam doors or talk back with attitude. I was quiet. I listened. I noticed things. I noticed the way the ranch hands kept their eyes down when my father spoke. I noticed the way my mother would flinch before she smiled. I noticed how a joke at dinner could turn into a lecture, and how a lecture could turn into something colder, something that sat heavy in the room long after the plates were cleared. I was a decent student, not a genius but steady, the kind of kid teachers said had potential. I liked books. I liked puzzles. I liked figuring out how things worked. My father didn't understand that kind of intelligence. He respected strength, you could see muscle money, and the kind of confidence that fills a room. If you were quiet, he assumed you had nothing to say. If you asked questions, he assumed you were challenging him. And I did ask questions. Not to be difficult. I wasn't trying to embarrass him. I was trying to make sense of the world. I remember one summer afternoon when I was about 12. We were sitting on the porch. The heat was thick, the kind that makes the air shimmer. Dad was talking about buying another piece of land, more acreage, more cattle. "Why do we need more?" I asked. "We already have so much." He stared at me like I'd spoken another language. "Because that's what men do," he said. "But why?" I asked again, genuinely curious. "Is it for money, for security, or just to be bigger?" My father's face tightened. "That," he said, pointing at me, "is why you'll never be anything, always thinking too much, always slowing things down." My mother tried to smooth it over. "She's just curious," she said softly. Dad's voice rose. "Curious doesn't put food on the table." I wanted to say, "But the table is already full." Instead, I looked down at my hands. He laughed once, sharp and dismissive. "The dumb one," he said, and it stuck. After that, he used it whenever he wanted to end a conversation. Whenever I didn't fall in line quickly enough. Whenever he felt challenged by my questions, he reduced me to that name, as if it explained everything. Rebecca learned to avoid being targeted. Caleb learned to perform. I learned to go quiet. I stopped asking questions out loud. I asked them in my head. I read more. I planned. By the time I was 17, I knew exactly what I wanted to leave. Not because I hated my family. I didn't. I loved them in the complicated way you love people who have hurt you without realizing the damage they've done. But I couldn't stay and become the version of myself my father kept insisting I was. So when I graduated high school, I didn't throw a party. I didn't beg for approval. I packed my bags, hugged my mother, and walked out of the house before the sun rose. My father watched from the doorway, arms crossed. "Don't come back when you fail," he said. I didn't answer. I just kept walking. And in the years that followed, I learned something my father never did. Silence can be a refuge, but it can also be a cage. After I left the ranch that morning at 17, I drove my old pickup north for 3 hours before I stopped. Not because I had a plan, but because the gas tank was nearly empty. I pulled into a small diner outside Abilene just as the sun was climbing over the flat Texas horizon. The kind of diner where the coffee comes in thick white mugs and the waitress calls everyone hon. I remember sitting in the booth by the window staring at the steam rising from my coffee and wondering if I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. Leaving home sounds brave when people tell the story later. In real life, it's mostly quiet and terrifying. I had 2 bags in the truck, $300 in cash, and no clear direction. But what I did have was something I'd never had under my father's roof. Space. No one telling me what I was supposed to be. No one calling me the dumb one. Just a long stretch of road and the feeling that if I kept moving forward, anything might change. That afternoon I drove to Dallas. Not because it was glamorous, it wasn't, but it was big enough that a quiet girl could disappear and start over. For the first year, my life was simple and hard. I worked the morning shift at a grocery store stocking shelves. In the evenings, I attended classes at the local community college. I rented a tiny room above a mechanic's garage that smelled like oil and hot metal. Most nights I studied until midnight. Not because someone told me to. Because I wanted to prove something not to my father but to myself. I wanted to know if the questions I'd always asked actually meant something. If curiosity could build a life. A year later, something happened that changed my path. A Navy recruiter came to campus. He wasn't flashy. Just a calm man in his 40s with a voice that carried quiet authority. He talked about opportunity discipline and service, about learning skills that mattered. Most of the students who gathered around his table were young men. I almost walked past. Then I saw a brochure about naval intelligence, information analysis, strategic planning, systems coordination. The kind of work that required patience, attention, and the ability to see patterns others missed. In other words, the exact skills my father thought were useless. I picked up the brochure. The recruiter looked at me and smiled. "You ever thought about serving?" he asked. I hadn't. Not really? But something in that moment felt right. Not dramatic, not heroic. Just right. 3 months later, I enlisted. The Navy changed me in ways I didn't expect. Boot camp was hard, of course. Early mornings, constant discipline instructors who seemed to have eyes in the back of their heads. But compared to growing up under my father's roof, it wasn't frightening. It was structured. And structure, I learned, can be comforting. For the first time in my life, the questions in my mind were treated as strengths instead of flaws. During training, instructors noticed I had a knack for analysis. I could look at scattered bits of information and piece together what they meant. I could sit quietly for hours studying maps, communication logs, or reports until patterns began to appear. The Navy sent me to additional training in intelligence analysis. It wasn't glamorous work. No explosions. No movie-style heroics. Mostly long rooms with computer screens glowing late into the night. But the stakes were real. The information we processed helped commanders make decisions that affected real people in the field. Sometimes those people were in danger. And that's when I understood something important: quiet work can save lives. Over the years, I moved through different assignments: Virginia, Washington State, eventually back to California. My job evolved from analysis to planning. I began working alongside teams that supported special operations units. That's how I first encountered the world of the SEAL teams. Those men were unlike anyone I'd met before. Calm under pressure, focused, humble in a way that surprised people who assumed elite warriors would be arrogant. What they valued most was trust. If they believed someone knew their job and did it well, they respected that person no matter where they came from. For the first time since leaving home, I felt completely accepted for who I was. Not loud. Not flashy. Just steady. Over 2 decades, my responsibilities grew. Eventually, I became a senior intelligence advisor assigned to a unit that coordinated operational planning for special operations teams deploying overseas. It was demanding work. And sometimes heavy work. Because when you're responsible for analyzing threats and advising commanders, you carry the knowledge that mistakes could cost lives. I never spoke about it with my family. Partly because my work was classified. But mostly because I had learned something over the years. People who underestimate you often reveal more about themselves than they do about you. My father never asked what I did in the Navy. Not once. When I called my mother every few weeks, she'd ask how I was doing. I'd tell her the truth, just not the details. "I'm doing good, Mom." That was enough for her. Caleb and I stayed in occasional contact as well. My younger brother had always been kinder than our father, though we weren't especially close growing up. He told me about his decision to join the Navy. Years later, when he mentioned trying out for the SEAL program, I remember sitting quietly with the phone in my hand for a long moment. Not because I doubted him, but because I knew exactly what that path demanded. "You sure about that?" I asked gently. "Yeah," he said. "Feels like the right challenge." I smiled. "That's a good reason." What Caleb didn't know was that by the time he began BUD/S training, my job already involved supporting units connected to the SEAL community. I didn't work directly with his specific class, of course. That would have been a conflict of interest. But the world of special operations is smaller than people realize. Names circulate. Reputations circulate, and people notice when someone carries themselves with integrity. Which brings us back to that afternoon on the parade field in Coronado. Because when Caleb's commanding officer stepped forward and saluted me, it wasn't because I was his sister. It was because somewhere along the way the quiet girl from a Texas ranch had built a life that commanded respect, even if my father never knew it. Until that moment. And now standing there in front of him with the Pacific wind blowing across the field and a Navy commander waiting for me to speak, I realized something important. For 22 years I had allowed silence to define the story my family believed about me. But silence, I was beginning to understand, isn't always humility. Sometimes it's just unfinished truth. For a long moment after the commander saluted me, no one spoke. You could hear the wind coming off the Pacific rolling across the parade ground. Somewhere behind us, another family burst into laughter as they hugged their graduate. But the small circle around my father, my brother, and me had gone strangely quiet. My father finally cleared his throat. "All right," he said, trying to sound amused. "What's the meaning of this?" His tone carried the same sharp edge it always had when something slipped outside his control. The commander didn't react to it. He stood calmly in front of me, hands folded behind his back. Up close, I noticed the lines around his eyes, deep grooves carved by years of responsibility and long deployments. "Sir," he said evenly, "I was greeting someone who's done a great deal for the men standing on this field today." My father frowned. "I'm sure she appreciates the attention," he said, "but I think you've got the wrong person." Caleb looked between us. "Wait," he said slowly, "you two know each other." The commander turned slightly toward him. "Yes, Chief," he said, "though not in the way you might expect." Caleb blinked. "Chief." That word carried weight in the Navy, especially in front of new SEAL graduates. Hearing it directed toward him already had him standing a little straighter. But his attention quickly shifted back to me. I could see the questions forming in his mind. I gave him a small nod, letting him know everything was all right. The commander glanced at me again as if asking silent permission. I understood what he meant. This moment belonged to me. I took a slow breath. "It's all right, Commander," I said quietly. He nodded. Then he turned back to the group. "Your daughter," he said to my father, "has been working with naval intelligence for more than 20 years. My father's eyebrows shot up. "Intelligence." He said it like the word itself sounded suspicious. "Yes, sir," the commander replied calmly. "Operational analysis and strategic planning." My father looked at me again, confusion creeping across his face. "You're telling me she's, what, a desk officer?" There was a faint edge of mockery in his voice. The commander's expression didn't change. "Sir," he said, "the planning done at those desks often determines whether the men in the field come home." That shut the conversation down for a moment. Caleb folded his arms, absorbing the information. "You're in Navy intel?" he asked me. I nodded. "Have been for a while." "How long?" 22 years. He let out a low whistle. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I smiled slightly. "You never asked." Caleb rubbed the back of his neck. "That's fair." My father still looked unconvinced. "So you push papers," he said bluntly. The commander's voice softened, but there was steel underneath it now. "With respect, sir, that's not quite accurate." He turned slightly so Caleb could hear him clearly. "Your sister has served as a senior intelligence advisor on several operational planning teams that support special operations units." Caleb's eyes widened. "Special operations." "Yes, Chief." The commander nodded toward the line of newly graduated SEALs behind him. "Units like the one you're joining." That changed the atmosphere instantly. Caleb's expression shifted from curiosity to something deeper respect. "Hold on," he said slowly, looking back at me. "You mean, you've been working with teams like ours?" "Indirectly," I said. "Mostly planning and threat analysis." He let out a short laugh. "And you never thought to mention that?" "I figured you had enough on your mind." Caleb shook his head in disbelief. Meanwhile, my father stood stiffly, arms crossed. He was trying to process a story that didn't match the version of me he'd believed for decades. "So you're telling me," he said slowly, "that all these years she's been advising SEAL teams?" The commander nodded once. "Yes, sir." My father studied me like he was seeing a stranger. "You never said a word." "I didn't think you were interested," I replied calmly. A few of the relatives who had gathered around earlier were still lingering nearby, pretending not to listen. But of course they were listening. Dad's face reddened slightly. Well, he muttered, anyone can claim things like that. I saw the flicker of irritation cross the commander's face, not anger. Just the quiet impatience of someone who had heard enough. Sir, he said evenly, your daughter's work has been recognized throughout our command structure. He paused. Several of the operational models she helped develop have directly influenced mission planning for deployed teams. Caleb looked stunned. You're serious? The commander nodded again. Very. Caleb turned to me. Does that mean some of the briefings we got during training? I might have helped prepare some of those threat assessments, I said gently. His jaw dropped. You're kidding. Number. For the first time since the ceremony began, my younger brother broke into a wide grin. Well, I'll be damned, he said quietly. Then he reached over and pulled me into a quick hug. Guess the family's got 2 people in the Navy after all. That moment eased some of the tension. But my father still hadn't moved. He stared at the ground for a long moment, then looked up at me again. His voice was softer now, though pride still clung stubbornly to it. If all that's true, he said, why didn't you ever come home and say so? The question hung in the air, and the answer came to me easily. Because every time I tried to speak when I was younger, I said quietly, you told me I was the dumb one. The words landed heavier than anything the commander had said. Dad looked away. For the first time in my life, I saw uncertainty in his eyes. Not anger. Not authority. Just uncertainty. The kind a man feels when the story he's believed about someone suddenly stops making sense. And standing there on that parade field with the Pacific wind moving softly through the flags behind us, I realized something else. For years I thought the moment I proved myself to my father would feel like victory. But it didn't. It felt like something quieter. Like a door opening. After the commander excused himself and returned to the other officers, the celebration slowly resumed around us. Families laughed again. Cameras flashed. Someone nearby popped open another bottle of champagne and the cork shot into the air with a sharp crack. But the little circle around my family had changed. Caleb was still standing beside me, occasionally glancing my way as if trying to connect the sister he remembered with the woman he had just learned about. My father, on the other hand, had grown unusually quiet. For a man who spent most of his life filling rooms with his voice, silence didn't sit comfortably on him. Finally, he cleared his throat. Well, he said stiffly, this has certainly been educational. No one responded. Rebecca, my older sister, had arrived late to the ceremony and had only caught the tail end of the conversation. She looked between us with curiosity. What did I miss, she asked. Caleb chuckled under his breath. Turns out our dumb sister's been running intelligence support for special operations teams. Rebecca's eyebrows shot up. You're joking. I shook my head gently. Number. She stared at me for a moment, then gave a slow whistle. Well, I guess Dad owes you an apology. The word apology seemed to land heavily in the space between us. Dad shifted his weight. Let's not get dramatic, he muttered. Rebecca crossed her arms. Dad. He sighed. Look, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. I didn't know what she was doing all these years. That's kind of the point, Caleb said quietly. For the first time that afternoon, my father looked genuinely uncomfortable. He wasn't a cruel man by nature, but he was stubborn, the kind of man who built his identity on certainty. Admitting he'd been wrong about something or someone was not something he'd practiced often. He glanced toward the ocean, watching the waves break along the shore beyond the base. I just assumed he began, then stopped. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. You assumed she failed. He didn't answer. Which was answer enough. I spoke before the conversation turned sharper. It's all right, I said calmly. 3 sets of eyes turned toward me. I never told any of you much about my work, I continued. Partly because of security restrictions and partly because, well, we never really talked about that kind of thing. Caleb nodded slowly. That's true. Rebecca tilted her head. But you could have said something. Maybe I admitted. But by the time I realized what people back home believed about me, it didn't seem worth correcting. Dad frowned slightly. What's that supposed to mean? I met his gaze. For 22 years, I said gently, you told everyone I was the dumb one. His face tightened. I was joking. Maybe, I said. But after a while, people start believing the jokes. The wind carried the distant sound of waves crashing along the shore. Dad looked down at the ground. "You should have told me," he said quietly. "I tried," I replied. He looked up. When I was 12? He blinked. "That was a long time ago." "Yes," I said, "it was." Caleb shifted beside us. "I remember that summer," he said slowly. "You and Dad arguing on the porch about the ranch expansion." Dad frowned. "That wasn't an argument." "It kind of was," Caleb said. Rebecca nodded. "You asked why we needed more land." I smiled faintly. "That sounds like me." Dad sighed heavily. "You were always questioning things." "Yes," I said, "that's the point." For a moment no one spoke. Then Caleb chuckled. "You know," he said, "that's probably why she's good at intelligence work." Dad looked at him. "How so?" "Because analysts are supposed to question everything." Caleb shrugged. "They're the ones who catch the details everyone else misses." Rebecca nodded. "That actually makes a lot of sense." My father rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. For the first time that afternoon, his expression softened. "I suppose," he said slowly, "I might have misjudged a few things." Rebecca laughed. "A few." He shot her a look, but there wasn't much heat behind it. Then he turned to me again. "So," he said, clearing his throat, "all those years you were gone, you were building this career." "Yes." "And working with Navy command structures." "Yes." "And advising the same kind of teams Caleb's joining." "That's right." He let out a long breath. "Well," he paused. "I'll admit, that's more impressive than I expected." It wasn't an apology. But for my father it was close. Caleb leaned toward me with a grin. "Not bad for the dumb one." I laughed quietly. "Guess not." A few minutes later, the commander returned to speak with Caleb about his upcoming assignment. As they talked, I stepped aside and walked toward the edge of the parade field. The ocean breeze felt cool against my face. For years I had imagined this moment, the day my father would finally understand that I wasn't the failure he thought I was. But standing there watching the waves roll toward the shore, I realized something surprising. The victory didn't feel like revenge. It felt like relief. Relief that the truth was finally out. Relief that the silence I'd carried for so long had finally been broken. And behind me I could hear my father speaking again, this time telling a small group of relatives something very different from what he'd said earlier that day. "My daughter works in naval intelligence," he was saying. There was hesitation in his voice. But there was also something else. Pride. And that was something I had never heard before. The celebration lasted well into the afternoon. Families drifted across the parade grounds in small groups, laughing, hugging, and taking photographs with the newly minted seals. The California sun had softened into that warm golden light that settles over the coast in the late afternoon, and the breeze from the Pacific carried the smell of salt and seaweed across the base. Caleb spent most of that time shaking hands with instructors and meeting the families of the men who had trained beside him. I stayed nearby, mostly quiet, answering a few polite questions from relatives who suddenly seemed very interested in my life. But the person who remained unusually silent was my father. For nearly an hour he walked slowly along the edge of the field, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, watching the ceremony wind down. I had seen that posture before. It meant he was thinking. My father didn't think quietly very often. He preferred decisions clear, confident, immediate. But when something challenged the story he had built about himself or the world, he needed time. Eventually, Caleb approached him. I was close enough to hear their conversation without trying. "You all right, Dad?" Caleb asked. My father nodded absently. "Just thinking." Caleb smiled. "That's new." Dad gave him a sideways glance. "You always were a smart mouth. Runs in the family." For a moment the two of them stood together looking out toward the ocean. Then Dad said something I didn't expect. "I was wrong about your sister." The words came out quietly, almost like he was testing how they felt. Caleb looked at him. "Yeah," he said simply. "I guess you were." Dad exhaled slowly. "I spent 20 years believing she'd gone off and, well, drifted." "Why'd you think that?" Caleb asked. Dad hesitated. Then he gave a small shrug. "Because she left." "That's it." My father rubbed his jaw. "I figured if someone leaves the ranch, they're running away from responsibility." Caleb shook his head. Or maybe they're running towards something else. Dad looked at him thoughtfully. You've been talking to her? A little. Well, Dad muttered, she never explained any of that to me. Caleb chuckled. You never asked. That line seemed to hit him again. The same realization I'd seen flicker across his face earlier returned. Finally, he turned and walked toward me. I watched him approach, noticing something unfamiliar in his expression. Uncertainty. My father had spent most of his life standing taller than everyone around him. Even in his late 60s, he still carried the broad shoulders of a man who'd worked cattle and fences under the Texas sun for decades. But now those shoulders looked a little heavier. He stopped a few feet in front of me. For a moment he didn't speak. Then he cleared his throat. Walk with me a minute, he said. We moved slowly toward the edge of the base where a small path ran along the coastline. The noise of the ceremony faded behind us. For several minutes neither of us spoke. The ocean rolled steadily against the rocks below. Finally my father sighed. You know, he said, when you were born, I thought I had the whole world figured out. I glanced at him. That must have been nice. He gave a quiet chuckle. I thought success was simple. How so? Land, hard work, reputation. He kicked a small pebble along the path. That's what my father taught me. I nodded. Granddad had been even tougher than Dad. That kind of thinking works on a ranch, he continued, but I guess it doesn't explain everything. No, I said softly, it doesn't. He stopped walking and turned toward the ocean. I didn't understand you when you were young, he said. That much is clear. He huffed a small laugh. You were always asking questions, always looking at things from angles I didn't recognize. That's kind of what intelligence work requires, I said gently. Yeah, he admitted, I'm starting to see that. Another long pause passed between us. Then he said the words I had never expected to hear. I shouldn't have called you the dumb one. The sentence hung quietly in the air. For a moment I felt 12 years old again, standing on that porch in Texas while he dismissed my questions. But I wasn't 12 anymore. I had lived an entire life since then. I appreciate you saying that, I replied calmly. He nodded once. Truth is, he said, I didn't know what to do with someone who thought differently than me. That's all right, I said. We all learn at our own pace. He glanced sideways at me. That was a polite way of saying I'm stubborn. I smiled. You said it, not me. For the first time that day, he laughed, a genuine, relaxed laugh. Then he grew serious again. I'm proud of Caleb, he said. You should be. But today, he continued slowly, I realized something else. What's that? He looked at me. I've got 2 children serving their country. I didn't respond right away. The ocean wind moved gently through the tall grass along the bluff. After a moment, he nodded again. And I guess he added quietly, I'm proud of both of them. That wasn't a dramatic apology. There were no tears. No grand speeches. Just a simple admission from a man who had spent most of his life believing strength meant never changing your mind. But in that moment, I realized something important. The strongest thing my father had ever done was admit he'd been wrong. A few months after Coronado, I went back to Texas. Not because I suddenly wanted to live on the ranch again, and not because my father asked me in some dramatic way. It was quieter than that, more like the way real families change inch by inch when they finally decide to stop repeating the same old hurt. Caleb had shipped out for follow-on training and preparations for his first assignment. Rebecca was busy with her own life, her own circle. My mother, as always, was the soft thread holding everyone together. She called one evening and said, Your dad's been walking around the house like he's got something to say. Maybe you should come home for a few days. So I did. I flew into San Angelo on a windy Thursday and rented a car. The drive out to the ranch was exactly as I remembered it. Endless scrubland, mesquite trees, fence lines that seemed to go on forever, and that familiar feeling of open sky pressing down like a lid. When I turned onto the ranch road, I saw the old gate still standing, the paint chipped and sun-faded. The cattle guard rattled under the tires, and in that sound alone I could feel years sliding back over me. My father was waiting outside the house. Not sitting on the porch like he used to, but standing near the driveway with his hands on his hips like a man who didn't know what to do with his own restlessness. He didn't wave, he didn't smile. But when I stepped out of the car, he walked toward me and said something that still surprises me when I remember it. You hungry? It was his way of saying hello. It was his way of saying, I'm trying. I could eat, I replied. Inside, my mother hugged me so tightly I could feel her shoulders shake. She didn't say much, just held on. I had learned over the years that her love didn't need explaining. We ate dinner at the same kitchen table where so many of my childhood wounds had been carved into me: roast chicken, green beans, cornbread. Simple food, familiar food. Dad talked about the ranch like he always had cattle prices, a broken fence line, the neighbor's new tractor. But every now and then, I noticed him glance at me as if he were trying to understand the woman sitting across from him. After dinner, my mother went to bed early, claiming she was tired. I suspected she wanted to give us space. Dad and I sat on the porch with 2 glasses of iced tea. The night air was cool and the stars were bright enough to make the sky feel endless. For a long time we listened to the cicadas and the far-off lowing of cattle. Then Dad cleared his throat. "I've been thinking," he said. I smiled faintly. "That seems to be your new hobby." He huffed a quiet laugh, then turned serious. "I got a call last week," he said. "From who?" "Caleb." That made me sit a little straighter. "How's he doing?" "He's all right," Dad said, then hesitated. "He told me some things." "Like what?" Dad stared out into the dark pasture. "He said you probably saved his life without him even knowing it." The words hit me softly, not like a punch, but like a weight settling into my chest. I took a slow breath. "Caleb's being generous." Dad shook his head. He said the briefings, the threat reports, the planning, he said those things are what keep men alive. I didn't speak. In my work, we never used the word saved. We used phrases like risk reduction and mission support and force protection. But Caleb was right in the plain way. Only a young man with fresh perspective can be right. Sometimes the quiet work does keep people alive. Dad's voice softened. "I never understood that world," he admitted. "I thought the only real work was the kind you could see, the kind that left dirt under your nails." I looked at my hands. "You can still have dirt under your nails and be wrong," I said gently. He nodded as if he'd been waiting for someone to say that. Then he said something else I never expected. "When you left," he said, "I told myself you were weak." I kept my voice calm, because I didn't stay and fight you. He flinched at the truth of it. "Because you didn't stay," he repeated quieter. "And I took it personal." "I didn't leave to hurt you," I said. "I left because I didn't know how to survive there and still be myself." Dad swallowed. The old man's pride rose in his throat, then slowly fell back down. "I didn't know I was breaking you," he said. I stared out into the pasture where the moonlight laid silver stripes across the grass. "You weren't trying to," I said, "but you were." For a moment, Dad's breathing changed. He wasn't crying, he never did. But his voice sounded rough. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what I called you." The apology was simple, no excuses. Just words. And that's how I knew he meant it. I nodded once. "Thank you," I said. We sat quietly a while longer. Then Dad shifted in his chair. "I want to do something," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "That usually means you've got a plan." He gave a small, reluctant smile. "I talked to my lawyer." That made my stomach tighten at first, because for most of my life, lawyer in our family meant conflict. But Dad continued. "I'm not changing everything," he said quickly, as if afraid of losing his nerve. "Caleb will still get the ranch. That's his dream, and he's earned it." I nodded. That makes sense. "But," he added, "I'm setting up something for you, too." I waited. He cleared his throat again. "The ranch brings in steady money," he said. "And I got those apartment buildings in Dallas. Your mother and I bought them years ago as an investment." I blinked. "You never told us that." He shrugged. Didn't think it mattered. He looked at me now with a strange mix of humility and determination. "I'm putting part of that rental income into a scholarship fund," he said, "in your name." I stared at him. "For what?" "For kids," he said, as if it should be obvious. "Kids who are smart but don't fit into the mold. Kids who ask questions." My throat tightened. Dad shifted uncomfortably, like emotion was an unfamiliar shirt collar around his neck. "You were right when you were 12, he said quietly. "We didn't need more just to be bigger. We needed to be better." For a moment I couldn't speak. Then I let out a slow breath and said the only honest thing. "That means a lot." He nodded once, staring out into the night again so he wouldn't have to look directly at my face. "That commander," he said after a moment, "he made me feel small." I smiled faintly. He didn't mean to. "I know," Dad muttered, "but it was good for me." He turned toward me. "You know what I realized?" he asked. "What?" That I spent years trying to build a legacy, he said, and I almost missed the people I was building it for. That sentence, spoken by my father on the porch of the house where I once felt invisible, was the true ending of my revenge. Not humiliation. Not payback. Just truth. Because the best kind of revenge isn't watching someone fall. It's watching them finally grow. The next morning, my mother made coffee and smiled the whole time like her heart had been waiting for this quiet peace. Before I left, Dad walked me out to the car. He didn't hug me. He wasn't that kind of man. But he stood there with his hands in his pockets and said, "Drive safe." Then, after a pause, he added, "And I'm proud of you." I nodded. "Thank you, Dad." As I drove away, the ranch road stretched behind me in the rearview mirror, and for the first time in my life, it didn't feel like I was running from home. It felt like I was leaving it with dignity. If there's a lesson in my story, it's this. Don't measure your children by the loudest success. Some people serve quietly. Some people love quietly. And some people carry strength so deep you won't see it until the moment it matters most. So if you're listening and this story touched you even a little, I hope you'll take a moment to think about someone in your own life you may have underestimated. Maybe give them a call, maybe tell them you're proud. Sometimes a few honest words can heal decades. And if you'd like more stories about second chances, family redemption, and the quiet kind of strength that changes everything, please consider sharing this story with someone who might need it and subscribing for the next one.